Hey again. I'm going to kind of briefly go over the coursework reflection, which is part of your final portfolio. I'm starting on the home page on Canvas because I'm going to just remind everybody kind of how to get there. If you scroll down to the bottom, you go to this inquiry project and portfolio information link. And then there's a a link for just the final portfolio. Okay, here we are on the final portfolio page, which is like your final exam, except that we kind of started it at the midterm, and it includes also your major assignments. We've been kind of building it all semester. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to just the coursework reflection link, and it kind of pulls up the assignment sheet. So the coursework reflection is a reflective piece that's specifically about the class. It's a little bit different than the writing theory when the way the class kind of came into it was I asked you to think about some ways that the class contributed to or supported or changed your perceptions of writing, along with a bunch of other things and a bunch of other kind of layers to your experiences and thinking. And you were asked to reference three things that were specifically from class. The coursework reflection casts kind of a broader net that is also just kind of completely focused on the class and your work just from this class. We started a coursework archive at the midterm, and you'll be adding some work onto that. And then going back and possibly changing, thinking, considering what selections you made for your work this semester to talk about, and kind of looking at, based on what you choose to curate and what you choose to put on this page, what it shows about either things you learned or struggled with or succeeded or revised for during the semester. I put this quote from Sandra Giles up at the top because I think that this quote, one of the things I really like about it is it just kind of makes the point that a lot of times reflections feel really awkward because we feel like we're supposed to say certain things, and one of the final things she says is teachers don't want you to say certain things. We want you to think in certain ways. The class is about how to think like a writer so that you can write well in a lot of different circumstances and a lot of different writing contexts. So I guess the point with that is that the reflection is not about trying to necessarily convince me that you did everything really well, or convince me that you worked really hard, or convince me that you learned everything, but it should be genuine, and it should cover an array of things. So it could be places where you did kind of struggle or not understand or revise, or had to revise for something, places where you did feel like you really succeeded or something was easy for you, things that you maybe learned about writing or research or your own process. It should cover a spectrum of experiences during the semester. And it's more about prompting that habit of mind of being a critical reflector, being able to see and talk about what's going on behind the surface of your text. How can you use the work you did this semester to see something about yourself, not just those individual pieces, see how they connect, see how they show patterns of what you learned and worked on in the trajectory of your thinking during the semester. So I'm going to scroll down here to the specific contents and requirements. What you want to do is have your reflection organized around specific points regarding learning, struggling, succeeding, or revising this semester. You can do this by choosing 2 to 3 key concepts: of rhetorical knowledge, knowledge of conventions, composing processes, critical reading, and critical reflection, or you can come up with some statements on your own about what you learned. And then for each point you want to make, or a key concept you want to focus on, you might select a few artifacts that connect together that help with that specific skill. So an example I include is that you could talk about what you did this semester with integrating sources or internet literacy and evaluating sources. It could be you want to talk about addressing audience, conducting research, writing in different styles, understanding your own processes. If you wanted to talk about just addressing audience, something you might think about doing is going back and using like understanding writing situations and our notes from class on audience and our audience discussion from the Jaguar commercial, and then excerpts from your own major assignments to talk about where you learned it, where we practiced it, where you try to apply it and revise for it in an essay. So it kind of shows a trajectory. And the one thing about doing it this way is it gives you a lot of wiggle room to think about what are the things you did learn and can really talk about, and choose to show me that. So it gives you a lot of freedom in terms of what you want me to see from your work this semester. And I'm going to show a few examples of what I mean by this. Here's an example of a student's reflection where she starts off her section with, I now have a better understanding of rhetorical knowledge and can effectively express it in my writing. So she's thinking just about rhetorical knowledge as a key concept. And she uses her digital essay, and she uses a few different pieces from her notebook to talk about that and some other kind of activities from class. She also talked about having strengthened her research process regarding reliability of sources and how to incorporate sources in her writing, and she chose a few pieces specifically about how she worked on that this semester. Another example is, I'm now able to find and use sources online correctly in order to demonstrate my knowledge about the topic of choice. So she talked about content farms and brainstorming search terms. She talked about her annotated bibliography, her digital essay, made some really good choices. You can just kind of see how it works. So I'm going to come back to the assignment sheet. I want to talk about some of these prompts that you might think about covering in terms of looking for patterns of stuff you want to talk about. So you could look for, one, specific areas of learning or concepts about writing you like to note. Number two could be specific skills or strategies you've been working on and revising for based on your personal theory, or some other things, any of the other things we're doing in class. Number three, differences and similarities in genres you've been asked to write in. So it could be about just kind of comparing writing styles and the different genre conventions in the research guide versus the digital essay and what that experience was like. For specific writing or research skills you've been successful with or struggled with in a particular assignment. You could think about possibly like critical reading skills, like research methods, research strategies, questions, inquiry, different ways of using sources, information literacy, like evaluating sources, researching authors, reading scholarly text, using tertiary sources. Those are some things we've covered in terms of just the research portion of the class. You can look for patterns you've noticed in your process or style. Maybe you tried out different writing styles or brainstorming methods, or discovered some things that really worked, for you. Or 6, areas where you've had to try something new or take a risk with a particular activity. So you have some options here. You wouldn't necessarily need to cover, all of these things, but it does give you just some ideas of some different ways you might look for things you want to talk about in your work. Okay, I'm going to scroll down here now to artifact and content requirements. So, and we've talked about this first. No images of work should be included without appropriate context, analysis, and explanation. So no just dumping pictures of your work in there, obviously. Should talk about everything. All artifacts should be readable on the screen, no download. So you can't use Word docs, but you can embed documents, and you can also use PDFs, which open in a new window. For notebook, work from your notebook, you're welcome to use your phone to take pictures, or if you have an app that allows you to do that easier. At least 10 artifacts of your work, including major assignments. So including, obviously the major assignments are the biggest part of the class, so it would be useful to hear you talking about both of those. So you would have 8 other artifacts besides those. Quote from at least 2 relevant course texts. A lot of times this takes care of itself if the artifacts you're choosing are reading responses and things like that. Otherwise, you have to go back and look through either like readings, handouts, presentations to pull something in from class. Should cover a range of activities, so pulling from some different places, obviously, and you should reference at least 4 of our key concepts. That's total. It's not like per selection or per individual section that you come up with for your reflective essay. Just sometime throughout the content of the piece, you've referenced at least 4 of them to talk about your work. Okay. There's also some drafting tips and ideas, and we're going to work on this in a second anyway. When you get to the brainstorming. look at the artifacts you've archived and think about where you see patterns. So like if you see several things about research, that might be something good to talk about. Split things up into sections. You can do things like, it might be easier just to do it by points. Like maybe you want to make a point about inquiry or audience or research or what you did with design or around a specific key concept that you want to talk about. Synthesize. We'll talk about this in a minute, but you are expected to quote or specifically reference things that you talk about in your work or what you've done in your work in order to really kind of break it down and explain what it is you want me to notice. You're also encouraged to synthesize. So again, we talked about that with your digital essay, like bringing a few things together to make a singular point. You don't necessarily have to have like one picture of your work with 1 to 2 paragraphs talking about that one piece kind of in a vacuum. You might think about, okay, I'm going to talk about what I revised for with design or with modes. And you might be able to use your brainstorming for your digital essay, an early draft, and a final draft to show the trajectory of your revisions. And so you're talking about all of those things in connection with each other, which kind of makes things a little bit more cohesive and connected. So you don't necessarily have to split everything up in like, this is an example of my work, here's the explanation. You're welcome to talk about things kind of together. I also want to talk about just some final points, like 3 final points about what a strong coursework reflection will include. It uses the language of the class. So you are referencing the 5 key concepts, using other relevant terminology that you've been practicing in class, in your content quizzes, reading responses, that kind of stuff. There's a list here of some of those terms. Insightful connections across different texts, so you're able to bring a lot of different things together and really kind of see connections across some different selections of your work and things we talked about in class. Also critical and close analysis and evaluating of personal style, process, skills. So you're going to show various examples of your work and quote from your own work or a really specific paraphrase. You want to reference specific things you've written and choices you've made in assignments, not just give me a summary of an assignment, which then just tells me like what my assignment was, which I already know. What I don't know is what you were thinking and working on with that assignment. So just make sure that you're also kind of thinking about that and how you can be really specific in terms of telling me what it is I'm supposed to see in the selections that you included. A couple of requirements, this last thing for just your digital and like kind of citation requirements. Provide images or links to specific work. So you can reference a lot of different work, but you should have at least your 2 major assignments and 8 other pieces that you're really going to focus on. So make sure I can see and have access to those, and there's some ideas for how you can do that down here. Provide specific titles for course text if you're referencing them. You don't have to cite them necessarily. It's just for a class. We're all using the same stuff. But I do want you to use the specific title for it, and perhaps a brief, and for individual pieces, a specific title and a brief summary of the activity, just to give me some context and reminder of what assignment you're talking about or what activity you're talking about.